Paul has highlighted one of the problems with the behaviour of the Corinthian believers. They were acting inside the church like those who were outside the church. He's reminded them of God's grace in calling them to himself from the lowest levels of Corinthian society, not from the upper echelons. Now he's going to remind them of the way he himself acted when he brought the gospel message to them. We're going to read from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. And I, brethren, when I came to you, came not with excellency of speech or of wisdom, declaring unto you the testimony of God. For I determined not to know anything among you, save Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. And my speech and my preaching was not with enticing words of man's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. There has been what I feel is a worrying trend in the modern world, where churches seem very keen to accommodate themselves to the way that the world goes about marketing its products. The idea seems to be that if we are to be effective in our witness to the world, we need to adopt the ways of the world in presenting the gospel message. That seems to be the reason why many churches seem to be merchandising their offering and making entertainment a key component of their activity, and I feel that it is a great pity. Whenever Paul came to Corinth, he was well aware of the kind of society that he was entering. We get a sense of his trepidation because he writes about being with you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling in verse 3. He knew what Greek society revolved around. He had just come from Athens, where many of the philosophers were based, and he himself was no slouch whenever it came to his ability to reason and argue cogently. You just have to have a look at his letter to the Romans to realise that that was the case. But it seems that he took a deliberate decision how not to preach on the one hand, with excellency of speech or of wisdom, verse 1, and how to preach on the other hand. I determined not to know anything among you save Jesus Christ and him crucified, in verse 2. It was to be the simple, straightforward preaching of the gospel. He would not rely on enticing words of man's wisdom, as he says in verse 4, but rather on the Spirit and his power, as he also says in that verse. It is an important principle for all of us to follow. Paul has already explained that we owe nothing to this world's education, and there's nothing that it can offer us in terms of promoting the wisdom of God, verse 24 of chapter 1. After all, the world by its wisdom knew not God, he also writes in verse 21 of that chapter. Paul knew that if he employed the ways of the world, there was a real danger that people who professed to be attracted to Christ would actually be attracted by worldly wisdom. That is no ground for genuine faith, and that is why he wrote that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God, in verse 5. The core of the gospel message is Jesus Christ and him crucified, verse 2 of this chapter. It's not a pretty message, because the cross was not a pretty place. It showed the heart of man for what it is, thoroughly sinful and at enmity with God, a display of the fact that men loved darkness rather than light because their deeds were evil, John chapter 3 verse 19. But it also shows the heart of God in all of its wondrous love, and a Saviour who gave himself freely to save us from our sins. And it is in him that our faith, and in him only, that our faith must be firmly fixed.